Welcome to Area 4. Did you know? Did you know that Moravians were not the first Protestants on the mission field? It is best to think of the Moravians as having the first concerted group effort toward missions, but other individuals had popped up here and there in the 1600s before the Moravians came on the scene in full force in the early 1700s. One of these early examples was a Presbyterian named John Eliot. He came to the American colonies in the 1630s, and by the 1640s was actively pursuing missionary work with the Native American tribes. He attempted to learn the local tribal language of the people with the goal of communicating the gospel to the people in their own language. He also wanted to be able to translate the Bible into their language. And he did translate the New Testament into one of the tribal languages, a remarkable feat considering the time and his lack of resources. But it is unclear how much of an impact that translation had. Eliot also practiced the strategy of creating Christian villages for those who converted, believing that it was in the people's best interest to break connections with their past way of life and move into a community where they could more easily be instructed in and practice their faith. When he died, much of his work died with him because others had not yet caught the vision for mission work. Some Protestant missionary activity was fueled by the colonialism efforts taking place in the 1600s. Holland and England began advancing their influence in South Africa and India and parts of China during this time, and just as the Roman Catholic nations sent along Catholic priests, the Protestant nations sent along church representatives as well, paid for and supported by the government. Most had a dual role of being a chaplain minister to the settlers who came from home to work and do business, and they also had the role as missionary to the native peoples. Having missionaries so closely tied to those with political and economic interests was not always good for the spread of Christianity, but many of those who served in this capacity did so faithfully. However, for a period of time, the Dutch government offered their missionaries a cash bonus for each person baptized. Needless to say, the number of baptisms skyrocketed. The question of how valid those conversions were is a question worth asking. A final example of these pre-Moravian Protestant missionaries is a tag team. Their names are Bartholomew Ziegenbalg and Henry Plutschau. You can look up the transcript to get the spelling of their names. Ziegenbalg and Plutschau, an early law firm waiting to happen. In 1705, these two German pietist missionaries went to India with the support of the Danish government. If we follow their stories in India, we can see 5 characteristics of pietist missions that were later characteristic of Moravian missionary efforts as well. Let me give you these real quickly without saying very much about them at this point. Their first mission strategy or missionary idea was that church and school go together. They were big on education and churches starting schools in order to educate children. So churches and schools went together. Number 2, the Word of God must be available to Christians in their own language, emphasizing Bible translation. Number 3, the preaching of the gospel must be done with an accurate understanding of the mind of the people. An emphasis on really knowing and understanding the thinking and the worldview of the people to whom you would be preaching. Fourth, the aim must be definite and personal conversion, a calling of individuals to respond in faith to the gospel. And fifth, the ultimate goal was an Indian church with its own Indian ministry. Getting to the point where the church is not controlled by outside missionary presence, but that local indigenous leadership is raised up from within the church. Learning the language of the people so that the gospel could be clearly communicated, with the end result of having an Indian church with Indian leadership operating in its native language, was a new way of thinking about doing missions. A lot of Protestants, as we will see, did not always grasp all of these ideas, and they did not become widely popular until the 20th century. But many of those 5 ideas become relatively shared across the board by Protestant missionary groups by the time we get to the 20th century. So Ziegenbalg and Plutschau were well ahead of their time, and with names like that, would you expect anything different?